group recollections. It kind of got more to somehow me being a speech maker, but in the way it was presented. But actually, we're going to go with somewhat of the original format, and I'm going to ask Steve and Sam and some others of you here that knew Dad to try and say some recollection as part of this from the parts of your experience with Neil Tillotson that you might have. And the things we passed out, has everybody got a copy of these things? Dad thought of himself as a Vermont Yankee. Certainly of the North Country, but on the Vermont side of the Connecticut. And one of the other things that I didn't actually put on here, he said we were lucky to live in New Hampshire because the air came from the west. There are a lot more things to his life that we can cover in the time we have here, or several of these times. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a glimpse of things, and actually I have my son James just gather a bunch of stuff from my files that he thought might be interesting, and that had been the case. That's what I was doing, going through, see what he gathered for me to talk about. Now, the principal story that I'd like to tell is how he left the North Country and ended up somewhere else in the world, and then eventually ended up coming back here. The family, his family came from all over this area up into the eastern townships and over to St. Johnsbury, certainly Pittsburgh and the Dixville area, Colebrook, and some of the pictures up here, and please come up and look at them afterwards, but he was always proud of his great-grandmother, Mary Titus Hodge, was one of the settlers in Dixville with David Hodge. This is a picture of his mother, Axa, and this is actually a picture of him at about 5 years old, dressed up pretty frilly just before he got beat up by the kids after he left and went out on the street looking like that. But he grew up in Beecher Falls mostly. He was actually born up on Hereford Hill because his grandmother was a midwife, and that's where she had her house. The house was later brought down on logs right down by the Connecticut on the river, and is down on the river now between Canaan and Beecher Falls. But at the time he was born, it was up on Hereford Hill. He lived in a couple of different places in Beecher Falls, of which the one that he actually lived in while he was in junior high school and high school was at right on the corner of where the covered bridge used to go across to the New Hampshire side in Beecher Falls. And his father had a general store on the bottom, and his room was the room right up on top. And this is a picture of the general store in the house that I'll pass that around for people to look at. Incidentally, I'm sporting a walking stick that's pretty well worn on the bottom, but he had a lot of fancy canes that people gave him over the years, but this wood dowel was one of his favorites, and he used to spend a great deal of time out in the woods tramping around with this stick. And generally, if he was in the woods, this was the red flannel shirt he was wearing. But you contrast that with his briefcase below that, and you've got the story of how a North Country kid ended up in the city. Well, his parents had had some rocky times. His father liked to go off occasionally on a bender, and his mother was a teetotaler. And there were occasional problems in the family, and it ended up really from the time he was about 12 to 13 that he had the responsibility of running the store when he wasn't in school. So after he got out of school, he'd work the store until about 10 o'clock at night and then go upstairs. But, he did a lot of enterprising things in the North Country while he was a kid, including getting his first speeding ticket in a horse and buggy right in front of where the Beach Falls Economic plant is right now. At the age of 15, his parents divorced finally, and he was given an opportunity by the owner of, or the then manager of the Beecher Falls factory. He offered to stake him the money it took to buy the store if he wanted to take that over and run it as his business. So Dad went up on Canaan Hill and thought for a while and decided during that time whether he wanted to stay in Canaan and really put his life on track in that, or whether he wanted to have a little more distant horizon. And he chose the distant horizon. He had a friend of his, and I'm not exactly sure how he met him, but the fellow's name was Bill Comstock from Lancaster. And the fellow had just come back from living on a chicken farm in Lowell, Mass, where he worked for his room and board, and went to a trade school there called the Lowell Technical College. So Dad decided, since Bill just came back and abandoned that position, that there was a job opening in the chicken farm down in Lowell, Mass. So he got on the train, and his mother gave him 2 bits of advice: keep your hair cut and always put a date on any piece of paper, which would make a mark. So he went down to Lowell and got his room and board on the chicken farm. He went to the Lowell Technical College as a bookkeeping clerk, and finished that course in a year, and then took a job on the side making ice cream cones and sodas in a drugstore in Lowell for a fairly princely sum of $14 a week for 6 days. He did that for a while, but his uncle, who was a builder in a town closer to Boston called Watertown, Mass., had just built the house for the chief chemist of the world's largest rubber factory at the time in Watertown called Hood Rubber Company. So his uncle asked the chief chemist if he had a job for his nephew, and he said he'd give him a try. So when offered the job, he had to decide to give up free ice cream and take a cut of pay down to $12 a week. But he figured that was the best thing he could do for his future, and he took that job and started working in the lab in Hood Rubber Company with 32 chemists and he was the only one to wash the test tubes and the beakers after they were finished. That was his job, washing, cleaning up in the lab after the chemists. But the chief chemist really took him under his wing because Dad proved to have an inventive mind that didn't know enough to know he couldn't do something. So he'd usually say he'd just go ahead and do it. And the chemist started giving him some projects to do. And lo and behold, he started developing things that some of the chemists couldn't. And with this aptitude and the encouragement from the chemist, he ended up going up in the ranks and getting some jobs as a chemist, even though he did not have that education. Now, he went to night school during this time at MIT and at various places to try and get some additional education. He took an aeronautics course at MIT thinking that he'd like to learn about airplanes in the this was around 1913 or 1914 when airplanes just came out, and he suggested to the professor that it might work well to have just a jet of hot air propelling the plane instead of a propeller, and the professor thought he was kind of nuts, so he went back to inventing things in the rubber business. But this is a picture of a house that he ended up owning in Watertown, as he did take a break in 1917 to go and fight against Pancho Villa as a member of the 7th Cavalry. He enrolled in the cavalry thinking he was going to join Pershing going over to Europe, but Pershing decided to spend the early days of that cavalry in the Texas and New Mexico border chasing Pancho Villa. And he had a couple of good stories about the training. The basic training was in Fort Bliss, Texas, when it was just a bunch of tents. There was no building there. It was a tent city. But he did go up into the rank of corporal, and he ran a Gatling gun as part of the regiment's artillery. He was a Gatling gun operator. He also had the largest horse, and he was not the largest soldier, so the largest cavalryman. But they marched to select their horses. They lined up all of the troopers, lined up all of the horses, and said, "Forward march," and the horse's rear end you ran into was your mount for the duration. He got out of active duty in 1919 and came back to Watertown, resumed working at Hood Rubber Company. He met a girl and married her, and they started a family, and his father-in-law had actually been the chief engineer for Stanley Steamer. Now, Stanley Steamer went bankrupt in the latter years of the, or early years of the Depression in 1929. And one day, Dad came home to his house and brought home a little jug of natural latex that had started coming into the United States through the port of Boston on its way to Berlin, New Hampshire, because the Brown Paper Company in Berlin had invented the world's first wet-strength paper towels. And they did it by dumping natural latex into the vats of the pulp, and when it was formed into towels and the fibers didn't come apart from each other. They stuck together and therefore worked as a wet paper towel. Wet paper towels are still made by dumping latex in the process water, but they use synthetic latex and not natural. But since it was coming in through the Port of Boston, the salesman tried to get Hood Rubber to buy some natural latex. You have to understand that there were all kinds of products made out of rubber in those days. But rubber is just the dried sap of the rubber tree. Natural latex is the sap. They would take it at the plantation and just bake it out in the sun, put it into bales, smoke the bales, and then ship these 500-pound bales of rubber by ship to various parts of the globe where they either put it in giant machines that had big rollers that pressed it into sheets, or they dissolve it with petroleum naphtha or gasoline in order to make a liquid that they could dip a product out of. Nobody really used the latex sap itself to make a product prior to the Brown Paper Company dumping it into the process water. So when the salesman tried to sell some to Hood Rubber, Dad got the project because all of the screwball projects that came in the door landed up in his lap. So he was assigned with an MIT professor to try and make an inner tube out of natural latex. That today would still be a difficult, if not impossible, task, and Hood Rubber Company, not being able to accomplish that, didn't want to have anything more to do with it, so he took some home. And he tried to make a couple of different products. He was going to make little things to put on your glasses to keep them from sliding off your ears. He was going to make some coat the little pads so that your glasses wouldn't dig into your nose, and was trying to make a couple of little bottles and various things. And one day he came home, and his father-in-law had tried to coat a piece of cardboard with some of this latex that was colored red. And he had tried to make a rear view mirror ornament for a Model A Ford, which was then the very hot novelty item, because it was the dice and all of the other things that you could hang on your rear view mirrors. And there were a lot of people buying those things, even though people weren't buying a lot of things. Those that could afford a car got some kind of a novelty to hang there. So his father-in-law said, "I've got one problem. The latex doesn't always stick to the cardboard. It kind of peels off in places." So Dad looked at it and examined it and pulled on it, and sure enough, it pulled away from the cardboard. And then he said, "My God, man, you know what we've got here?" So he took a pair of scissors, and he took a pair of, it's just the chipboard cardboard like you have on the back of an 8.5 by 11 line pad. Cut that out with scissors in the shape of a cat's head, with the cardboard extending out about 2 inches past this neck, but it was shaped exactly like that. And he attached that to a maple dowel. When he later set up production, he had 5 one-gallon maple syrup tins with an extension on the top and 5 clothespins on a maple dowel. And he would dip the cardboard into the latex, coat the cardboard, and then you pull the latex and cardboard right off of the clothespin, dry it, and then with the cardboard still inside, inflate it with air, which separated it from the cardboard, and then pull the cardboard out, which of course destroyed the form. But it made a balloon. So every time you made a balloon, you had to make a new form to make the balloon, which destroyed it every time. So he actually took a dozen of these balloons around in Boston on Friday the 13th of April, 1931, because that was actually the lowest day of the entire um, depression, and Hood Rubber Company had shut down for the day. And as a matter of fact, they were going to be shut down for the next 2 weeks. So he took a dozen of these balloons around Boston to the carnival jobbers that sold street merchandise to the peddlers and tried to get an order. At the last place he went to on Washington Street, the DeChico brothers, while he was showing one brother, the brother upstairs looked down and said, "Hey kid, what have you got?" And so he showed him that he had a balloon, and they gave him an order for the Patriots Day Parade, which was the 19th of April, 1931, for 15 gross balloons. So they came back and set up production with the 5 maple syrup tins, and Dad manned the scissors, and his father-in-law did the dipping, and his brother, who had been in an automobile accident, did the drying, and then Dad at night would actually take a stamp like you'd get at Bill Sambito's and stamp the faces with aniline dyes on the balloons. They ended up making 13 gross of balloons in time for the Patriots Day Parade, and he delivered them to the DeChico brothers Saturday morning. They had already told the peddlers they were coming in. The peddlers took them out. Now you have to understand again, prior to that time there were balloons, but they were all made out of solvent dissolved rubber, much like rubber cement. If you've ever seen the consistency, but they thinned that out so it was quite thin. And to make something this thick took about 6 or 8 coatings and dryings of rubber cement before you made a balloon. And balloon factories blew up a lot. One spark, and that was the end of the factory. So they were also limited to just making round balloons. Nobody had ever put a face on a balloon. Nobody had ever put ears or made a character out of a balloon. So he had something quite novel with that, and the peddlers took them out and sold them at the Patriots Day Parade. And he went up to a couple of peddlers and asked them how they liked them, and being the rough sort that they are, they wanted to discourage him. They didn't know who he was, and they didn't want somebody cutting into their turf, so they said, "Oh, they're lousy, they're full of holes." But they wanted more. So he had some mixed reviews, however. It was feeling a little gloomy when he got to the Lexington Common, and there was a little girl with one of these with helium in it on the end of a string. And she lived evidently right on the common, and her mother was calling her to come into supper. Before she would go into supper, she pulled the balloon down, kissed it, and then ran into her house. And that was his market research and development and everything else he needed to know that he had a good product. So we went the very next Monday to a laundromat in Watertown, rented their basement for $10 a month, with the understanding that he'd pay them $1 more a month for each month until he got up to $50 a month. But that was the rent. They didn't have any use for it. It was the Depression. He hired 12 people, and he had $267 in his pocket, and he put to his name, and he put $267 into the first week's payroll and buying the raw materials that he needed to make balloons. And he gave the DeChico brothers a 1-year exclusive contract based on the fact that he would sell to nobody else, but they had to buy everything he could produce. So he took his, and they had to pay him every Saturday morning. So he put his $267 in, made the balloons, delivered them Friday, got his pay Saturday morning, paid off his workers, bought more materials the next week, and in that first year, he did $84,000 worth of business in 1931. So he, after that year was over, took a Greyhound bus ticket that would take you anywhere in the country you wanted to go, whenever you wanted to go, for one price. And he went to every major city in the country, sometimes sleeping in the bus terminals, but he put on either one or two carnival jobbers in each major city in the country, and started selling these balloons. Now he, at the home front, was automating his plant at the same time that he was coming up with a novel product. He was coming up with new ways to make balloons, because in other factories they still had a lot of manual labor. Well, he ended up by 1935 having automatic machines that were making these balloons. So even though he started selling these at $2.50 a gross, making them by hand, he was able to, many years later, still sell them for $2.50 a gross, even with raw materials and everything else going up. So this started the rubber business that really became the main focus of his business life. He liked to dabble in many other things, thankfully, which got him back up here, and ended up finding that well, after Watertown, he did move 2 years later. He outgrew the laundromat and bought an old bicycle factory in Needham. And this is a plant of the old bicycle factory in Needham, and I'll pass that around. That became quite a large operation and made a lot more things than balloons, but one of the other things that it did was made a connection based on Dad's friendliness and gift for gab and needing to have a good bite to eat every once in a while. And once he found a good place to eat, he'd usually frequent that place often. The place was called the Cheerio Restaurant in Needham Heights. And the lady who owned and ran that restaurant was a wonderful person, and he thought she should be doing more than just running a little restaurant, and he tried to talk her into coming to work for him just for part-time. Well, that lady was named Phyllis Nichols, and Phyllis Nichols came into the plant to actually be his assistant or secretary. Later married the plant maintenance superintendent, who also was from Needham, named Ray Barba. And Phyllis and Ray Barba, with their connection to Dad, eventually had a reason to have their son come up and try his hand at the caddy camp at Balsams, and that brought us Steve Barba. So that's actually your introduction for a few things to say, Steve. If you'd like to come up.
In other words, it's your turn.
It was very harsh, right? I took a lot of notes.
I'll pass you the stick.
Rick's explanation of my family connection is very accurate. Indeed, my own mother, who passed away when she was in her 30s, was the first floor supervisor that Neil Tillotson ever hired. Her name was Lottie, and that's where my father met her. And apparently female supervisors in a factory that employed mostly men was a rarity, but I don't remember my mother very well, but Mr. Tillotson was always telling me that I looked a lot like her and that she was a commanding force. I know that when my dad had been dating her for a number of years, and one day he said to her, "Well, what are we going to do on a Saturday night?" And she says, "Well, I don't know about you, but I have a date." And he said, "You do?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Well, how come?" She said, "Because it doesn't look like you're ever going to ask me to marry you." So he asked her to marry her and marry him, and they were married. And she died when I was 8. And 2 years later, my dad married Phyllis Nichols. But genetically, I'm Tillotson Rubber too. Rick and I have been friends for well over 45 years, and every time I encountered his dad, I felt a lot of feelings as a person who knew how hard he worked my parents, and I never could remember not working for him, because I used to go down in the factory in Needham where I grew up and work there after school, and it was actually freedom for me to be allowed to come to the Balsams in 1959 to enroll in the caddy camp and to have an outdoor job done in the factory and to learn all about golf and about being an independent entrepreneur, as all caddies are. And for years after, you know, the kind of relationship that a son would have with his father, I felt too. And I know that my dad, when he passed away the same year that Rick's dad passed away, they were great friends, 13 years apart. Mr. T had 102 and my dad at 89, but they had worked over 40 years together, and they knew each other very well. My dad remembered Mr. Tillotson in a very human way, because they were colleagues and did lots of fun things together, as well as worked hard together. And memories of Mr. Tillotson are replete. I have a large notebook of talks I had with him. I took notes every time we had a chat, and I was fortunate to interview him for about 9 hours for New Hampshire Public Television. And I keep on urging them to produce that film, because it's a magnificent film. I know it will be. He was so wonderfully open. I do remember him saying, when I asked him about his marriages, because he had 3 marriages, he said, "Well, when this one with Louise is over, I don't think I'll do it again." He was 100 years old. I think one of the most telling conversations I ever had with him was really towards the end of his life. And he had a box of goodies under his cabinet over at the house. Things that people had given him that related to the Balsams. And I knew the box was there. And I had demonstrated my real interest in displaying information about the Balsams. But there were things in this box that I didn't have. And I asked him if I could look through the box, because he pointed it out to me before, years before. And then I asked him if I could take it over to the hotel, and I never offered to return it, and it never has been returned. But it's all out on display. It's not as if I've pocketed it in any way. But kind of as a way of deflecting his attention by getting him to talk about something else other than what was in this box, I asked him about Frank Dudera, because you see, it was Frank Dudera who was present in 1954 in the hotel in the spring when the hotel was unheated and it was going up for auction. Fred Harrigan, who had been Mr. Tillotson's lawyer for years and who represented Mr. Tillotson on his land purchases up here, even though Mr. T didn't frequently get back home, although I don't think he missed a 4th of July parade in, 95 years or something. But before he owned the hotel, he didn't frequently come here. There wasn't a lot of reason for him to, and he did. But Fred Harrigan, he was still interested in buying land, and Fred represented those interests. And then when the Balsams came up for sale at the auction, being foreclosed upon by the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, he importuned Mr. Tillotson to come to Dixville and take a look at the property, and with the idea of putting in a bid, because there was no one else that was likely to be interested. And the government was foreclosing on Alvin Coleman, who had run up debts to the tune of about $600,000. Captain Dudera and Alvin Coleman hated each other, as I understand it. They did not get along. Captain Dudera never really wanted to sell the hotel to Coleman, but he had made a deal. It was a lease purchase deal, and Mr. Coleman was able to fulfill that deal and eventually took over purchase of the hotel. But there were many stories that I heard as a kid from locals and from former staff members that told how, because the captain continued to live in the captain's cottage, which is where Warren and Ellie lived for so many years and where the chef lives now, that there would be sabotage going on all of the time. And of course, Coleman had brought wide open gambling to the hotel, something that Captain Dudera didn't favor, and got bigger and bigger every season until Sherman Adams had the state police raid the hotel on August 4, 1951. We celebrate that anniversary every year. So, when Mr. T came in April of 1954 to the hotel, it was unheated, and there he was in the John Dix room with just a few people around, with the auction about to begin, and Fred introduced him to Frank Dudera for the first time. And Mr. Dudera wasted no time by saying, "Mr. Tillotson, you have the money, I have the expertise. I'm willing to form a partnership with you whereby I'll run the hotel if you'll buy it." And Tillotson really said to me that he didn't really want the hotel. He loved the land. The fact that his great-grandmother had homesteaded there and his grandmother had lived there way out in Hodge Valley where the ski area is today, he said always made him sentimental for his grandmothers, because they didn't have a right, as I understand it, to be on the land. They didn't have a deed. And he said that when he would come visit his grandmother, she would always say to him, "Did you tell anybody that you were coming?" As if maybe they could keep it a secret that she lived there. So he said to me that the best description as to why he succumbed and offered a bid was in a fit of middle-aged sentimentality for his grandmothers. The grandmother he knew, the grandmother he didn't know. Mary Titus Hodge died 2 years before he was born in 1896. He was born in 1898. She died in 1896. In the Tillotson Suite, we have that picture right over right on the wall in the bathroom. Everybody can see it. She's a formidable person. When you take a look at that picture. Well, anyway, I said to him, "Well, how did that work out? This partnership that you had with Mr. Dudera?" And he said, "Well," he said, "we didn't do badly, but the captain wasn't feeling well, and so we immediately had to find other help to actually run the hotel." And I said, "Well, what kind of man was the captain?" And he said, "Well, he was a good man." I said, "Was he your friend?" And he said, "Steve, no, he wasn't my friend." I said, "Well, why not?" He said, "I'll put it to you this way. Frank Dudera never did anything important that he didn't tell me about in advance. And Frank Dudera, whenever we discussed something, he did just as we had discussed. He was a very trustworthy man. But he couldn't be my friend because he was from down below." And I almost said, well, Mr. T, I'm from down below. But for him, it was a very important part of what friendship meant, because he also said that he learned everything he needed to know about all the things he ever did in business by listening to the men around the stove at his father's store. He said that their discussion of politics, these are local men, their discussion of politics, their discussion of hunting and farming and bringing up kids and all of that, he listened to very intently. And he was very confident that because he'd understood what they were saying and why they said it, and it all made sense to him, that he could handle himself in the outside world. So when he met this fellow from Lancaster, the fellow said he lived at a chicken farm and went to a little commercial college. That's what Mr. T did. And I don't think he ever had chickens afterwards, but
He was never eating chicken.
you know, when Ricky said that Mr. McDonald, the manager of the first manager of Beecher Falls Factory, Mr. McDonald. By the way, we have a family by the name of McDonald's who come to the hotel and stay every summer, and they have written the family history, and they are the great-grandchildren of Mr. McDonald, of the same Beecher Falls. When Mr. McDonald made that offer to Mr. T, and he decided to go up on the hill to think about it, the way he describes that story, and I've heard it a dozen times, he said, I sat down under the tree and put my mind to that offer and decided that's not what I wanted. And he got up and went back to Mr. McDonald and said, no, I've decided to go out into the world and to make my living out there. And then he did it. I mean, did you know that the average in America today, if you're under 27 years old, the great likelihood is, if you're not married, that you live at home still. There are all kinds of stories in newspapers and magazines and on television today talking how to get rid of your grown-up kids. And here he was at 15 years old, being willing and able to decide to go out onto his own. He was enterprising. He was bold, even though he decided things with great deliberation, and he outweighed everybody. One of my favorite stories, again, of his was when nobody was interested in the waterfront in Boston, Mr. Tillotson bought wars. He bought the waterfront in Boston. And in fact, he said that the Bank of Boston, which was his primary bank, wouldn't even loan him the money because they thought it was such depressed real estate. So he used his own money. And the last wharf he sold was Commercial Wharf. And indeed, they still have a compound at the end of Commercial Wharf where Mrs. Tillotson lives today. And the compound's got big office space. It's got a little studio apartment. It has a wonderful apartment for the Tillotsons and a three-car garage and all sorts of space. You get paid tens of thousands of dollars a year for it today. He made this deal back in early 1970s with a contractor who bought it so that he could make condominiums out of these big old warehouse buildings that were there. And he made the deal that he would be able to live in that compound for a rent of $500 a month until he and his wife passed away. And he was in his 70s then, and the contractor was in his 50s. He thought, well, why not? Right? So that contractor did his thing and then died, and the next one did his thing and died, and the next one took it over and died, all waiting for Mr. T to stop having to pay the $500 a month rent. Now, I don't know exactly how true this story is, but I understand it's pretty true. Just a few years ago, he was in his office, and on the wharf, his office all had this great big wall map of the world. It was always the most impressive thing when you first walked in. And then there were windows all around the office, and next to the windows next to his desk, there was a boat. They must park them, what do they do? They moored to this wharf. And it was a beautifully restored tugboat. And Mr. Tillotson loved boats. In fact, he had a business that was right in this office called Alden Brothers, and they designed boats. And of course, he owned the Tillotson Company, which built fiberglass sailing yachts, and he owned the Hodgson Brothers in Maine, which was a boat building company. He just loved boats. As Rick said to me the other day, what was the phrase, Rick, about why he liked boats? There were no fences or something like that?
He could, there were no roads. He could go wherever he wanted and just set sail.
Right, so he had the freedom of the ocean to go in any direction he wanted. Well, he was particularly admiring this fully restored tugboat. All of the fixtures were shining, all of the wood was polished, and the crew was snappy. And so he went upstairs for lunch or something and told Mrs. Tillotson to look out over the porch and look down on this beautiful boat. And while they were looking, the crew starts talking to them. And then the owner came out and indicated that he was pleased to see that they knew a little thing or two about boats, and that they were such admirers of this boat, and they could obviously tell that Mr. T was of an age that that's not normally the case, and they soon found out how old he was. And they said to him, well, we're going to go out into Boston Harbor tonight and have a cruise and see all the lights come on in the city. Would you like to join us? And Mr. T and Louise said, yeah, we'll be happy to do that. So that night, cocktail time, down they go, get on the boat, go out into the harbor, and have a wonderful evening, and come back the next day, and said what kind of an evening they had, and I think it was the secretary said, you were out with Billy Joel? It was Billy Joel's boat, and I don't know whether Bruce Springsteen was on the boat or Bruce Springsteen's manager. And of course, he didn't know who Billy Joel was. He didn't care. I don't think Billy Joel cared who Billy Joel was that night, because Mr. T was such a fascinating person. The thing about him that impressed everybody is how unimpressive he was until you settled in. Because he would kind of walk around and you'd think he was a caretaker. Frequently our guests would mistake him for a caretaker, and if he's out there before black fly control, he'd be like this, and they'd be more like this. He'd just have this gentle little flick to keep the black flies off him, and he always wore long sleeves. Apparently, when he worked at Hood Rubber, he'd been involved in a major fire. I don't know that I ever saw his bare arms, but before he went off to ride horseback for a couple of years in the cavalry, he had burned his arms and his legs and his chest, bad enough so that he spent considerable time in the hospital. And he said it was very painful for him to ride horses during those 2 years. And I don't think I ever did see him in anything but a long sleeve shirt, ever. So I don't know whether he had scars on his arms. But he was certainly a man who kind of came in the back door and into your relationships and in real life. And you never knew when you were going to see him. And he never knew, I don't think he ever had a day that he considered to be a day off. I know that he never had a plane flight that he considered not to be business, except for when he went to Antarctica, and he said, this is the first ticket I couldn't write off because they can't grow rubber on all that ice. I think the last, and there is no end to stories here, but I'll tell one that I think was particularly poignant. He said that when his parents were getting along and he was a very young boy, they brought him out one time to see his grandmother, and then they headed out to the hotel, and they went to the spring house that was on the entrance road. Now that's not the spring house that's there today. This is the one that preceded that. And that the original spring house allowed horses to kind of drive right in and take a drink, and there was also a spigot for people to take a drink from. And he told me this story about how he remembered not seeing the hotel when he went by, but when he got off to get a drink of water, he turned around and he could see the hotel through the woods, and it was a very impressive first glance for him. And so in 1994, on the 40th anniversary of his owning the hotel, I began pressuring among my partners that we rebuild the spring house. The spring house had been torn down years before because it sat right next to the road. There was no leeway whatsoever. I'm sure the plows would have hit it, and cars would have hit it, but horses apparently were able to make it by without hitting it. And so Raul gave me a little guff and said he didn't think we had time to do this, so I went out and ordered the bronze plaque. It said in 1994, we recreated this spring house. And that was enough motivation for Raul to go ahead and build the spring house. I just took pictures, looked at old pictures and scaled it up and did my best to copy what the old one looked like. And we moved this one off the road. We actually we piped the spring into the spring house. And there's hardly a time you can go by there without people being there, taking a drink or taking water. And he got upset with that. He thought, well, all those people taking that water. And I said, well, gee, the spring has been just 30 yards up the road, and they've been taking water there just as much all these years. And he said, well, isn't there anything we can do to just slow the water down a little bit through the spigot? And I said, it's been flowing like that for 14,000 years. What do you want me to do? I said, if we stop it there, it'll just flow around it. But he had this notion of conserving and not wasting. And but after the spring house was built, I can tell you that it was not uncommon to see him there, taking the walk from the fort over through the woods and getting himself a drink of water. And we actually had to cut some trees down on the bank so we could turn around and look and see the hotel through the woods. I've since learned that lots of you, lots of your parents, lots of your relatives from the past got their first kiss there, proposed marriage there. And Dr. Dicker told me a disgusting story, which I won't repeat to you, about what happened at the spring house with a bottle of whiskey. But Mr. Tillotson was a very dynamic force in my life and in my parents' life, and he lived a very full life. I personally feel privileged to have known him and have no regrets for him or for me with regard to the time we spent. He was certainly very generous to us and very appreciative. Even he didn't believe that the Balsams could come back. His effort to open the hotel in the winter was a last-ditch effort. And if it hadn't have worked, I asked him what he would do, and he said, well, you know, that New Hampshire house would make great space for factory conveyors. We could put long conveyors on every floor. I said, you'd make that place into a factory? He said, well, maybe before we got to that, we'd try making it a school. I said, what kind of school? He said, I don't know, some kind of school that celebrated common sense. And that was pretty typical. Thank you very much. I enjoyed talking about it.
Just a little bit about his coming back up here, other than the hotel. He had a camp up in Canaan for quite some time, and when I was little, I'd come up with him, usually on a ride from Boston in his Studebaker. And I didn't do too well on the main turnpike, which we usually came up that way, and then took 16 from Gray, and I'm sure whoever got that car afterwards had to do something about the back seat, because I didn't travel well. I remember going on some gold panning with Dad and my mother and Ray and Fay Wells, who were his cousins. Now, Ray and Fay were the original people that found land or woods deals for him and kind of looked after and took care of it. Now, they had their own farm just up over the line from Beach Falls and Hereford. And they weren't that energetic about expanding the woodlands. And eventually, both Fay and Ray passed away, which gave someone who is, I would describe as Dad's best friend, the opportunity to take the job, and that's Sam Owen. And Sam did have a lot of energy. He was just afraid that the woods deal wouldn't work out and he'd have to go back to canvas. But as it turned out, the woods operation worked very well, and Sam had a lot of people trying to get this pumpkin from down below, buy their land at an ungodly high price of $20 or $25 an acre. And Sam found a lot of these deals for him, and they bought a lot of land up in Canada. And one of Dad's great pleasures in the latter part of his life, when he wasn't making business deals, was going out in the woods with Sam. I wonder, Sam, if you could just say a couple of words to the group about some of your thoughts or recollections.
I recognize the cane. I'm not much of a speaker, but Mr. Tillotson loved to get into the woods and just wander around. I led him around when he had cataracts on his eyes. He'd still make these trails. But he had one special place in Hereford. We called it Beaver Meadow. And it was more or less a dream place. We cleared it all up. We were going to put a lake in it. And we were going to have condominiums and whatever. Never did do that. But we did a lot of dreaming there. And when he was 100 years old, we always talked about putting a road on the Hereford Mountain onto the top of it, you see. And he come to me one day and he says, Sam, if we're ever going to have that road, we better get at it. I said, all you got to do is just tell me and we'll do it. We put the foundation in 7 days. It took a little longer to get some gravel up there but we could get up with our four-wheel drive vehicle in 7 days. He, like Ricky just said, he took me out from under a cow, and I appreciated that. We did made a lot of deals, and we did a lot of foresting, and we did a lot of reforestation. I think we have left something for the future. We have probably more than 1 million seedlings. We started in 1966, and we have trees there that are a foot to 14 inches now. Most of these plantations we have cut every third row so that it'll let the sun in and they grow a little faster. You get a much bigger volume out of a plantation than you do out of a natural growth, because they're planted so far apart, you see. But we've had a lot of good times, him and I. I don't know, I guess we were the best of friends. I know I considered him my friend.
What Sam hasn't told you, they used to go off in Sam's pickup truck.
Yeah.
One weekend over, nobody really knows where in Canada or Vermont they ended up. But they were supposedly visiting grave sites, but I think they...
Uncle Lee Dawson and married. We did that several falls. But when he was 90 years old, he would climb that old mountain.
The last time he climbed Hereford Mountain, he was 90?
Yeah. We were up there when he was 90. Of course, it'd take a little longer to get that, but he'd walk and he'd fall down about every 10 or 15 steps, you know. But he was awfully pretty.
He always said he liked hiking with Sam because he could fall down and Sam wouldn't say anything or make a fuss, just wait until he got up and then they'd keep going.
He thought I didn't know. I'm sure he knew that I knew when you fell down. But, I never let on. It used to take him a while to get up. You had to go right around, you know. He wasn't very tall, and it was easy for him to fall. Yeah, he was a great man for this part of the country.
Anybody got any questions they want to ask either one? Excuse me.
Is the factory in Colebrook still operating?
Yeah, the factory in Claticook, that was another deal that Sam found for us. And he wrote me in first and had me come and look at it. And it looked almost exactly like the same character as the old factory in Needham had. So I knew when Dad saw that, he'd want to invest in it. And, so we put some balloons in there at first, and then we're actually making some chemicals there, and then Best Glove Division that's out of Menlo, Georgia. And that's was another product that he invented along the way. Back in the, I guess it was right after the war. No, it was maybe just before the war. All you could get was leather work gloves. So he decided that there ought to be another way to make a work glove other than leather. So he went and got a canvas glove in Woolworth, dipped it in his latex tank, and made a rubber-coated canvas glove, and that was the start of the industrial work glove industry other than leather. But by the time that we had that plant up there, Best Manufacturing Division ended up going up there, and it still operates there today, making industrial work gloves. And they're actually one of our more successful divisions. Have a great guy that's been running that as if it's been his own business really for 20 years now. Mike's been there. And, one of the things that Dad always did in his business structure, and there's a little bit said about that in the things we passed out, but he believed in 50-50 partnerships. He figured if he had 51% and the other person had 49, that was somebody working for him, not with him. And if he had anybody that was not worth much, having that control over him wasn't going to help the situation. If somebody had 49% and they were worth quite a bit and they were really gung-ho, they would spend their energy trying to get the control rather than trying to build the business. So that when you started out 50-50 equal from day one, there was never any, and it did work out that way. Nobody ever spent their energy trying to play company politics to take over the business. It was more like a marriage. You got along and you built the thing, or you didn't get along and you parted company. And so that was the key to Dad's being able to build a lot of businesses in a lot of places and still have in his personal management of the business one part-time secretary and himself. Now, we had an accounting office and a lot of other people, but for the actual looking over what's going on in the actual management, it was just Dad and the part-time secretary for most of the time, because he had partners looking out for their own interests, which looked out for his interests. He spent most of his time traveling around encouraging people to grow rather than worrying about what they were doing. So it was a wonderful formula, and it was a successful thing that built a lot of people and built a lot of economic value to many parts of the of the country. The best glove division is in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, and Tennessee, Guatemala, Canada, Europe. And there's just a lot of people out there all working to help each other, and that's what makes it a really great company. Sam's always been just a wonderful person who is, in another 30 years, may get close to retirement age.
Maybe 20 years. 2 years ago.
But one of Dad's philosophies, obviously, since he worked to the ripe age of 102 and a half, was that there's no such thing as retirement. He never believed in retirement, and somebody, there was a young pup of 70 or 75 said they were going to retire. And say, what do you want to do that for? But, and we still have quite a few people, fortunately, in the company that are quite mature and intelligent and are keeping a lot of the knowledge and fabric of the company together. I'll tell one last story, and then any other questions, and that is, he was working in Fall River. He was 101 then, and I generally, when he came down to work in Fall River on a Wednesday, he and I would go to lunch, and then I'd drop him off at his office. So I dropped him off, and that parked the car, and somebody came running around that he had gone up the stairs to his office and had slipped on the top step and fallen down 2 flights of stairs. And so I came running in, and he's crumpled up on the landing with his head had struck one of the little boxes that they put the keys for the night watchman to punch. Well, it had cut that in, and so there was a lot of blood going around. But other than that, he actually was okay. But they called the ambulance, and the ambulance took him to the Fall River Hospital. And they registered him and checked him in. And the doctor, the first thing unusual, he's flipping through the chart, and he said, this is a pediatric chart, because he was 101. They were only, he came in the computer, who was not Y2K ready. He came in as a 1-year-old. The next thing funny, that they're taking the information down, and the nurse is asking him about the insurance and all, and he had to tell her it was a workman's comp case. So he stayed there for a couple hours till they were sure. He thought he knew he was fine, but they were sure he was okay. And then we brought him back and drove him back up to Boston. And he was back down at the office the next morning at his regular time. Any other questions?
Could you tell us a little bit about being in Guatemala, please?
Guatemala, Guatemala came second. His first venture into Central America was in Nicaragua. And he actually went down looking for rubber in this area, going back to his wartime during World War II. He was hired by the U.S. government to prospect for rubber in the Americas, because the U-boats of Germany and Japan had cut off all rubber supplies, which mainly came from Africa or Liberia, in Liberia, Africa, or in Malaysia. Both of those sources of supply for rubber were cut off to the United States. So the U.S. government sent him down to South America and Central America to find rubber supplies that they could take by land up to the U.S. to make tires for the Army trucks and give rubbers to the war effort. So he did a lot of prospecting for rubber throughout all of Central and South America at that time, and he knew what to look for and where the rubber growing areas were. Now, they weren't growing rubber in Guatemala by that time. They were not growing rubber in Nicaragua, but it was the right climate. So he bought a big banana plantation there and shipped the D-12 bulldozer Raoul's down on a ship to try and clear the land to plant trees. And about 2 months after the bulldozer arrived, the Sandinistas took over, and there went the plantation and the Raoul's bulldozer. So
My bombardier.
and his bombardier. So he was a couple of years after that. Firestone, who was our main supplier, had a plantation in Guatemala that they grew the seedlings to sell to the other plantations. And Firestone during those years was going through a lot of trouble themselves because of competition and their own structure and financing. So they were selling assets, and it turned out they wanted to sell that seedling plantation. It was also the dairy. Latex is harvested out of the trees a cup at a time, put in 5-gallon pails, brought on people's sticks with a pail here and a pail there to a collection vat in the middle of the plantation, poured out into a vat, and then they're brought to some centrifuges just like they use for milk. As a matter of fact, they're made by De Laval, the same people that make the milk centrifuges, and that creams the latex, and that's the way it's sold. So they had one of these dairy processing plants on the plantation. So we bought that, and then the manager who had been running that plant stayed to manage the plantations, and is still running them today, although we've expanded quite a bit and bought a lot more, usually abandoned coffee plantations, and cut down the coffee trees and planted rubber trees, which take about 7 years to grow before they produce, and then they'll produce till they're about 40 to 45 years old with daily tapping. Great thing about rubber for a developing country is that trees are tapped every day. So a farmer with a plot of rubber trees goes out with he and his family and taps a tree every day, just like milking the cows every day. It's not like coffee beans or other crops that are planted and then harvested once a year by a lot of people being brought in. Farmers can actually own their land and own their trees. And most of the rubber supply that we get and the latex that we sell comes from small farmers in that area. But, Guatemala is an up-and-coming rubber producing area. And a lot of that is thanks to Dad's foresight in helping that come true. Anybody else?
Okay, okay, Herb.
You mentioned that your dad was in the cavalry.
Yes.
Did you know in 1937, the U.S. Army Cavalry went through town, past the Bud Hole, and had war games where the golf course is by the hotel?
I didn't know
I
that.
didn't know there any pictures or anything about
Frank
it.
Dudara did that.
Yep, right there.
Frank did it?
Along with covered wagons, the guns, the whole works, or else Mohawk. We went out and watched the war games. My father was always then.
On the polo field.
Yep.
We ought to do that again. Yeah.
I just want to know when the Balsams was built.
Steve, when the Balsam was built?
We're still debating that.
It's a trick question.
It is. But for many years, Dr. Gifford assured me, because he was married, as you all know, to Marjorie Parsons, who was the great-granddaughter of George Parsons, who built the Balsams. Owner of Parsons House on the corner of Carson Block where Hill's store is, and he also owned the Parsons Farm Inn down by the shrine, down where the shrine is. So Dr. Gifford says that he had evidence in his home that would pinpoint the building of the Balsams at the conclusion of the Civil War, and that George Parsons did it as a project for people coming home from the Civil War who needed a job, and set the date at 1866. And we've never been able to prove that. I know that there was a hotel in Dixville built by a man named Tucker, that lasted for a couple of years, from 1862 to 1864, and then fortunately for him, he took out a fire and casualty insurance policy with Aetna just 2 weeks before the place burned down. It may have been some reference to that, but we were just listed on the National Register of Historic Places and hired a professional historian to do the research. And so now her date for the beginning is 1874. But whenever Dr. Gifford's great-grandson comes back from the Merchant Marines, he goes into the house and stays there and starts rummaging again through all the stuff that's still in that house about our local history. There were just reams and reams and reams of material in there. And I believe Dr. Gifford. I believe that there had to be a place there in 1866. But I can't prove it.
Well, why I asked is, about 2 weeks ago, I had a box of family things left at my house, and in it is this picture of the Balsams being built. And Matthew's house, Dr. House, was a hammer. Her mother was a hammer. And this was my grandfather who helped build the Balsams.
Holy crap. This is the Mount Washington. No, it's not the Balsams. This is either the Mount Pleasant House or the Mount Washington. I think it's the Mount Washington.
Well, this is on the back of the old one, but it's so faint, I didn't know if they could print it, like you don't move the sample. You put it through the computer.
It's not the
And on
Balsams.
the back of it, it said the Balsams, and it said that my grandfather.
I'll bet you, just looking at those two towers and the angle, the angle is the Mount Washington, but I can't, it may have been the Mount Pleasant House across the street.
That's not the Nimbus in there, no? No.
Not with all that rock there. I have pictures of the Mount Pleasant, I think it may be Mount Pleasant, which is across the street from the Mount Washington Hotel. But it's not the Balsams. I wish it were.
Right on the back, it was written that it was the Balsams, but my grandfather. I don't think he ever worked down there.
There's a man coming to the hotel in a couple of weeks who will be able to identify it without any doubt. This has been an incredible source for me.
Find out what it is.
I will. Did you know the Balsams is said to have the first commercial airline, first corporate airlines in the state of New Hampshire? This is the 75th anniversary of flight in New Hampshire, the 100th anniversary of flight in the world, and from Wilbur and Orville, right? And John Dixon gave me an album a while back that included inside a picture of one of the original Wright flyers. Those airplanes that Orville and Wilbur Wright created and flew on in Kitty Hawk, they made 8 other models, and those models were taken around the world to demonstrate, and one of them was in Dixville. It's really an incredible aviation history fact. Fernandine has been a great source on flight because you knew the pilots who flew the planes that came to the Balsams every day, 3 times a day. But I will find out what this hotel is.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt right now because it's getting late. And I know some of you want to come up and see this stuff up here, so I'm going to just call it the end of the program. And I want to thank All three of you gentlemen, very much. I hope you've all enjoyed it. I'm sure you have. So if you all want to come out and just look at the materials.